Hello, we are live. I'm Chris Lehto. Welcome to the channel. I'm so excited today to be talking with, honestly, my new favorite astrophysicist, actually, Avi Loeb, Professor Avi Loeb. And really, he is starting the Galileo Project. So excited about that, hunting for UAPs. So that is essentially why he is here today. We have short time. Very happy to have his time. So this is Avi Loeb, a very striking picture of him. He got his PhD in plasma physics at the age of 24. So just think of that, plasma physics PhD at age 24 from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And then he subsequently went on to the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton for 5 years. And he started work there as a theoretical astrophysics or physicist. 93, he moved to Harvard, and 3 years later was tenured at Harvard University. He's now the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science and former chair of the department. Professor Loeb also holds a visiting professorship at the School of Physics and Astronomy at Tel Aviv University. And he's a prolific writer. So he's authored nearly 700 research articles and 4 books, including this recently released book, Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. So I'm very excited, super excited. This video really couldn't be possible without my Patreons. Thank you so much to you guys. I really do appreciate everything you provide. If anyone wants to join, if you want to join the Patreon team, please consider supporting. But as always, just being here and watching with an open mind, I think is probably the best form of support. If you do like the video, please like and subscribe. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest, Professor Avi Loeb. Welcome, Avi. So great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, excellent. Just a couple other points you mentioned is that you were in the Air Force as a captain, right? In Israel, I
That's
understand all
true. Yeah.
Israelis.
In Israel, there is a obligatory military service, and at age 18, I had 2 options: either to be drafted as a regular soldier, or to be recruited into an elite program called Talpiot, where I could serve for 8 years. And at the same time, in the first 3 years, I did my military training in paratroopers. I drove tanks. I parachuted from airplanes. I've been in all the sections of the military, but I belong to the Air Force, and I eventually got a rank of captain. And in parallel, I did my first degree in physics and mathematics, and eventually got, as you mentioned, my PhD in plasma physics at age 24. And during that time, I also developed a project that was the first one to be supported by the Star Wars initiative of President Ronald Reagan at the time in the mid-1980s. So I remember General Abramson coming to visit us in Israel, and we presented the project and the idea, and he liked it a lot. And it was the first funded project internationally that the Star Wars initiative collaborated with a foreign nation about it. And that brought me to Washington quite often. We got a few $1 million a year in funding, and established a whole department around this project. I was the theoretical component. I led the theoretical component of this project, and there was an experimentalist working with me. And in one of the visits to Washington, I decided to visit Princeton, New Jersey, and they allowed me in and introduced me to Freeman Dyson. And that eventually led to my career in astrophysics, because Freeman asked me whether I know John Bacall, an astrophysicist, and I said I've never heard of him, and I didn't know how the sun shines. And he introduced me to John, and John eventually at lunch invited me for a month visit and checked about me, and eventually offered me a 5-year fellowship. And I didn't know anything of the vocabulary. I basically started from scratch, and I ended up in astrophysics, got an offer from Harvard that nobody wanted, because the chance of getting tenure at Harvard was very small. And then 3 years later, after arriving to Harvard, I got tenure. And at that point, by the way, I was never in particular interested in astrophysics. I was mostly interested in philosophy. And I always had plan B of going back to the farm where I was born. I was born on a farm, collected eggs every afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm pretty much a common person. I mean, I'm not anything special. And
Is that a kibbutz? I'm sorry. Is that a kibbutz?
it's similar to a kibbutz, except so it's
Yes.
called the moshav. The difference is in a kibbutz you share all the property, but in a moshav each family has its own farm, and you basically have a collective organization. But each family makes its own revenue based on the farm that it has, and that's called the moshav. And we had the pecan and nuts trees. My father was actually the head of the pecan nuts factory in Israel, the national one. And so I pretty much grew up with nature, and I was not a city boy. I was not social in any way. And that is reflected in my later career because I connect to nature much more than to people. Every morning I jog for half an hour, 3 miles, at 5 a.m. in the company of birds, ducks, rabbits, and wild turkeys. And I enjoy that much more than interacting with people. I mean, nature is really beautiful. And for me, space is sort of an extension of nature that we find here on Earth. It's actually unspoiled by people, most of space, except the moon that we landed a few times. And
the low Earth orbit, maybe a little...
low Earth orbit, but most of space is. By the way, what Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos did was basically use their wealth to lift their body by 1% of the Earth radius. That is not very impressive if you think about space. The size of the universe is 10 to the power 19 bigger than the radius of the Earth. And Branson and Bezos just lifted their body by 1% of the Earth radius. So to me, showing off in space is an oxymoron.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's, and we're all impressed. I'm very much impressed, actually. I know there was a lot of blast back, to the billionaires on going in their rockets, Jeff Bezos and Branson. But, I've asked a lot of people and thought about it myself. If you think about it, if you had an option, that's a great question. If you had an option to ride on one of those rockets, on the next, let's say Branson rocket or on Jeff Bezos rocket, would you accept it?
Oh, definitely. I would definitely do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I would definitely do it, but I will not brag about it. I will not show off. It's just for the experience. I really want to go to space. The one reason I'm seeking intelligence in space is because I don't often find it on Earth. And for me, every adventure is a thrill, and my wife says that if aliens ever land in our backyard, I should make sure I do 2 things. One is leave the car keys with her. And the second thing is make sure they don't ruin the loan when they lift off.
That's amazing. I feel so akin to your thoughts. But I haven't gotten to that level of commitment yet, I guess. I think most people would reconsider if really presented with the option to take Jeff Bezos' position and step on that test that first time.
Right.
Personally, I think they were very brave, and I respect them for taking that chance.
Yeah, space tourism may become a fashion, but one thing is there is only one person, Clyde Tombaugh, that discovered Pluto, that actually really left Earth. His ashes were put on the New Horizons mission, and they are making their way out of the solar system. So he's really the only person that departed Earth, sort of forever, so to speak. His ashes
forever
himself, yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, well, so Avi, Professor, I guess why don't we move through? I have a first kind of picture here that I thought would maybe let me bring it up. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so this picture is Oumuamua, and I saw it, and because I asked for some questions on this object, or just to this interview, and one of the questions was basically, what is the shape of Oumuamua? Let me find, or can you explain this picture? I'm sure you're well acquainted with it.
Yeah, so the name of the object is Oumuamua,
Oumuamua,
which
yes, I'm sorry.
means a scout or a messenger from far away in the Hawaiian
Yes.
language. And the reason it was given this name is because the telescope that discovered it is in Hawaii. The name of the telescope is Pan-STARRS. It's on Mount Haleakala. Actually, 4 months before the discovery, I visited that mountain in Maui, Hawaii. And it's really beautiful if you are sort of above the clouds when you look out. And all observatories are beautiful. My wife says we need to make a tour around the world to see all the observatories, because they are situated always on top of mountains in beautiful locations. And Mount Haleakala is no different than all others, and it's quite an amazing sight. And so that telescope over there discovered this object. The survey itself by Pan-STARRS was designed to find the near-Earth objects. The dinosaurs were killed 66 million years ago when a giant rock the size of Manhattan Island crashed on Earth. And until then, the dinosaurs had an ego trip. They were the biggest animals, and they felt very proud of themselves. They didn't look up much into the sky, and then their ego trip was tarnished as soon as this giant rock hit the ground. Now we have much smaller bodies, but we have the human brain, so we can design telescopes that look at the sky and monitor objects that may collide with the Earth and prepare for that. And so the Congress tasked NASA to find 90% of all the objects bigger than roughly the size of a football field, 140 meters. And so we are making progress on that front. And the Pan-STARRS telescopes were aimed at finding such objects. And Oumuamua is one of them that it identified. It's big. It's of order 100 to 200 meters. We don't know exactly.
Yeah, this is it right here, right? It's just this little circle, I guess, right in the middle. If you guys can see that.
What you see as streaks of light are stars that are,
Yes.
The object moves relative to stars. So if you have an exposure for a certain amount of time, the stars move relative to the object. And therefore, you see them, if you take a sequence of snapshots, you see them as a sequence of dots. And that's what you see, like a line associated with each star moving in the background relative to the object which you are focusing on.
Huh.
But the reality is that the object is moving relative to the stars because it's closer to us. And this object was roughly the size of a football field, but the distinction is of this object relative to everything we've seen before is that it's the first object that came from outside the solar system. And the reason we know that is because it moved too fast to be bound to the sun. So it just came from outside, and it's the first one we discovered close to Earth because we were monitoring the sky with Pan-STARRS for the first time in human history. And after a few years, we found this object. Now, a decade earlier, I mean, the reason this was intriguing for me is a decade earlier, I wrote a paper saying that Pan-STARRS will not discover anything. We estimated how many rocks we expect in interstellar space based on what we know about the solar system that ejects rocks. And we said, Pan-STARRS has no chance of finding anything by a factor of 100 to 100 million, really big factor. And then it found this object. So that was a surprise, and therefore I was intrigued. But then, of course, the astronomers assumed that it's probably a comet, because most objects in the outer solar system that can be easily dislodged from the solar system by a passing star or some other perturbation, they are icy rocks. And when they come close to the sun, they would get heated up, and you will see evaporation, like gas or dust around it. But this object didn't show any gas or dust. We looked at it very deeply with the Spitzer Space Telescope, and nothing, no carbon-based molecule around it. Yes. So then it was definitely not a comet of the type that we are familiar with. And then people said, okay, well, if it's not a comet, it's an asteroid, bare rock. It has no ice on it, just rock. But then the problem was that as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight that it reflected changed by a factor of 10. The sun acts as a lamppost that illuminates the darkness around us, and every object big enough we can see by since it reflects sunlight. So the fact that the area of the object projected on the sky changed by a factor of 10 as it was tumbling implied a very extreme shape, most likely a flat shape, pancake-like, and that was unusual. And then
I'm sorry. Yeah, this is there was one question related to that. Was this from Trevor? Is basically, while depictions of Oumuamua tend to be cigar-shaped. Sorry, I've read it so many times, but don't say it. My understanding from the telemetry data is it could also have been saucer-shaped. What do you believe was the object's most likely form?
Okay, so science is not about belief. Science is about analysis of the data, and the data was best fit at the 90% confidence level. There is a published paper about it, not mine, but someone else's, that indicates that if you try to fit the variation in reflected light, then most likely the object was flat, pancake-shaped, not cigar-shaped. And there was an argument actually already in the discovery paper of this object saying most likely it's flat, pancake-shaped, not cigar-shaped, because it's the most likely state of an object that, based on what we see, rather than in terms of the amount of energy that its tumbling includes. And so the bottom line is that the 90% confidence, we can say it was flat, most likely. But the artist depicted it as a cigar. And if you imagine a piece of paper tumbling in the wind, when you look at it sideways, it looks like a cigar projected. But in reality, it is flat.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, exactly. So so that's what people concluded based on the analysis of the reflection of sunlight, that it's most likely flat. And it's not a matter of belief. But then the artist made it sort of like a cigar. So the artist, the artist doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of referees, scientific referees.
So it sounds like what you can say for sure is that you believe it's flat, or not believe, but
90% confidence, the analysis of the reflected light as it was tumbling implies that it's flat.
Okay, so it could be saucer-shaped, I guess.
That's the most likely shape based on the scientific data that we collected. And in fact, in the discovery paper already, before they analyzed the light curve, the reflection of light as it was tumbling, before they did that, they already argued that it's most likely flat. The reason I know that is because when I submitted a paper for publication arguing that it might be artificial, the referee was telling me, yes, this makes sense because it actually looks most likely flat based on the discovery paper, where they said that this is the highest energy state of a system that was tumbling the way it did. If an object is being kicked around as it's traveling through space for billions of years, it's most likely to be in the highest energy state. So that was the argument in the original discovery paper. But then someone analyzed the reflection of sunlight and also argued, based on a completely different argument, based on the reflection of sunlight, that it's flat. So that's the most likely situation. And then, in addition, it was strange in a way because it was pushed away from the sun by some additional force. And that's the thing that convinced me to suggest that it may be artificial, because the only explanation I could give it was that it's the reflection of sunlight that gives it a push. And therefore, it has to be very thin, and nature doesn't make such objects. And turns out that in September 2020, less than a year ago, there was another object discovered that is pushed away from the sun by the reflection of sunlight without a cometary tail. It was given the name 2020 SO, discovered by the same telescope. And the astronomers that discovered it realized that actually it came from Earth. It's a rocket booster that was launched in 1966.
Okay, excellent.
And we know that it's artificial. We know that it had thin walls, and therefore it had a large area for its mass. So here is an artificial object that is different from a rock, and we could tell that because there was no cometary tail and it was pushed away from the sun. So I'm saying the same logic can be applied also to Oumuamua. The question is, who produced it?
Exactly. I was kind of blown away that this was the first interstellar object that we've actually detected. I guess I just assumed that, comets and meteors. They were just flying through our solar system, on their path through the universe or the galaxy.
Right. No, so that's exactly the paper we wrote a decade before. We said, okay, rocks are ejected out of planetary systems, because if a star passes by and gives them a kick, they get dislodged from the solar system, and that happens. So then you would expect some population of interstellar rocks, but we calculated how many of them you expect, and we forecasted that you wouldn't see any with pan-stars. So even people that try to explain the abundance of objects like Oumuamua, saying that they are rocks, they find that there is a problem. There were papers about that saying, you just need too many rocks. And other people that try to explain the excess push of Oumuamua argue that it may be a nitrogen or a hydrogen iceberg, something that we've never seen before. So people are suggesting to explain the anomalies of Oumuamua as an object that we've never seen before. And it must be very common because that's the first one we've seen. And my point is, if it's nothing we've seen before, it might as well be artificial in origin. And if a caveman was to find a cell phone, the caveman would say it's a shiny rock, because that's what the caveman is used to finding, on a daily basis. And then, of course, it's the beginning. It could be the beginning of a learning experience if the caveman is curious and if the caveman is willing to learn something new. The caveman will start pressing on this shiny rock and realize that, it actually records his voice. And if he presses on another button, it can take his image. So it's actually something else. It's not a rock. And for us to realize that, of course, all astronomers other than me try to argue that it's natural in origin, but they had to say it's just like a shiny rock. It's something special, something different. We've never seen it before. It's a nitrogen iceberg. That's the latest fashion.
A nitrogen iceberg.
Yeah, some chunk of nitrogen chipped off a planet like Pluto. And actually, with my students, we did some calculations about the abundance of such chips. Even if you take all the nitrogen that you find on Pluto, assume that Plutos exist around other stars, and then they get chipped off completely, and you just put as much nitrogen as possible, all the nitrogen that you have, into these chips, you still don't get enough to make a population that will explain the discovery of Oumuamua. So there is a mass budget issue. But nevertheless, people say, oh yeah, maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg. To me, it reminds me of this analogy of metaphor of a caveman saying, oh, it's just a shiny rock. My point is, we need to collect evidence about future objects that look as weird as Oumuamua. And then once we have a high resolution image, when we pass close to such an object, nobody would be able to deny the difference between a natural rock, be it a nitrogen iceberg or whatever you want to imagine, and an artificial object. And if it looks artificial, we can land on it, just like OSIRIS-REx landed on Bennu, the asteroid Bennu, and we can start pressing buttons. And then it will be clear, that it's not a nitrogen iceberg, if indeed it's an artificial object. So, a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial.
Extraterrestrial. Yes, so that's amazing. I love the reference to Galileo. I love I think you mentioned it in your recent Scientific American article, where you say he's forced to basically to recount his opinion or his view or his statement, I guess, that the universe is it's not Ptolemaic. It is Copernican, essentially, heliocentric view. And when he's forced to basically recount that, he says under his voice, he whispers essentially, and yet it moves. I love that. And yet it moves.
Right. No, the point is the philosophers were trying to argue they don't need to look through his telescope, that they know that the sun moves around the earth. And moreover, if they knew it so well, why did they put him in house arrest? Today they would cancel him on social media. I mean, it's obvious that they didn't want his message to be heard because they were worried that it might be true, because otherwise, why, if you are confident, it reminds me always of Einstein, because in 1930, there were 100 authors that wrote a book disputing Einstein's theory of relativity. And when he was asked about it, he said, "Why do you need so many authors? If there is a good argument, it's enough to have one. In principle, it's enough to have a kid saying they are making the argument. You don't need authority. You don't need to put someone in house arrest to make the case that the sun moves around the earth. That's ridiculous." But you would think that over 4 centuries since Galileo time, we would learn the lesson that we are better off collecting evidence through our telescopes than having a prejudice. The truth is, a few weeks ago, there was a paper published in Nature Astronomy magazine by a philosopher that raised philosophical reasoning or arguments as to why Oumuamua must be natural in origin, not technological, really. And I thought to myself, haven't we learned something in 4 centuries? I mean, why would people come back to philosophy making the correct argument rather than looking for the answers through telescopes, which is basically the premise of the Galileo Project?
And I guess this is also, you mentioned a good point there, which is going and just looking at the evidence, and I feel like that's what's going on now. So I'm sorry, I really just got into this world. I've always been interested in science and cosmology and chemistry, basically trying to figure out really what life is about. I'm just like you. I love nature. I'm out in the ocean. I love to surf. Anytime I'm in the ocean, I just feel more natural. So in all those instances, with Galileo and the Copernica idea, is they will not look at the evidence. I've seen that as well. I didn't bring it in here. I didn't want to make this some astrophysicist v astrophysicist, but Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's a lot of people in this UAP community that are upset with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Well, I should tell you that the one thing I told my team, my research team in the Galileo Project, and we can talk more about what the project is aiming to find, but I told them at first that we should keep our eyes on the ball, not on the audience. Just like they say in basketball, just look at the evidence and act accordingly. Let's not react to what other people say. That's not relevant. And as far as I can say, the person that you mentioned keeps his eyes on the audience. He's basically an entertainer. He's trying to make his audience happy. And I don't think that's the right approach to doing science. Science is guided by evidence and not by prejudice and not by trying to make people happy. And the best example I give in that context is Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff told his customers that if they give him the money, he will make more money out of it, irrespective of what the stock market does. And that was a happy thought. And they were so happy that they gave him their money. What could be better evidence for that? He was very happy that they gave him the money because he knew that he cannot fulfill this premise. Everyone was happy. They were happy. He was happy until the experiment was done. Okay. And when the experiment was done and they asked for their money back, he couldn't deliver. So he was put in jail. And how do you tell if an idea that seems beautiful to everyone is a Ponzi scheme or not? You can tell by collecting evidence, trying to do the experiment. And my point is, it's not up to how many likes you have on Twitter, because the idea of Bernie Madoff had a lot of likes. People liked it so much that they gave him the money. What else? It's not just likes on Twitter that cost you nothing. It's actually giving him your money because you believe the idea is beautiful. And my point is, many times over in history, human history, ideas were beautiful, but once the experiment was done, they turned out to be wrong. And therefore, the number of likes on Twitter are irrelevant as to the truth of an idea. Okay. Unfortunately, in science right now, there are lots of people that are trying to gain as many likes as possible and improve their image and try to be liked. And they, because they're benefiting either financially or in other ways from being liked. But whether reality abides by the same principles depends on data, on evidence, and it's not a matter of being liked. And I think this is, whether we are the smartest kid on the block or not is the biggest question that science can ask. And just ridiculing it makes little sense, because if you don't look through the windows, you will not get rid of your neighbors. If you have a neighbor and you're not the smartest kid on the block, the fact that you ridicule looking through the window and you say, I'm the smartest, wouldn't make you the smartest. There might be a smarter kid on the block and you wouldn't know about it. And guess what? One day that smarter kid will knock on your front door. But until then, you can pretty much believe that you are the smartest, get as many likes as you want on Twitter. Who cares? That's not what we are facing. We want to gain a scientist. I'm talking as a scientist. I want to gain a better understanding of reality. What is the reality that we live in? One thing I know is that most stars formed before the sun. Okay, that we know from data that we collected. We have the star formation history of the universe. Most stars formed before the sun, by billions of years. And we know that about half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So if you replicate the same circumstances, you might as well get similar outcomes. So there could have been a civilization similar to ours that started working on its technologies a billion years ago. And my point is, a billion years is a long time. So if you send out an artificial intelligence system that can self-replicate because it's connected to a 3D printer, we allow artificial intelligence to drive cars now. Within a decade, they will make life-death decisions, medical decisions, right? Just like doctors. These are systems that you can educate early on and give them the principles of how to operate with the world. Just like you give kids, you educate kids and then you send them to the world and they live on their own. So you can imagine sending such AI systems into space and they will be completely autonomous. They don't need to consult with us. They will learn from experience, just machine learning, and they will be able to behave on their own. I mean, the distances between stars are so huge, they cannot ask us for any guidance. They will just go out. And we can imagine doing that within 10 years, sending those systems to space. They would be smarter than us, smarter than any astronaut. We don't need to send astronauts. We just send those systems that can replicate themselves. And in a billion years, they can land on all the habitable planets in the Milky Way galaxy. And, if you just, this is our future, so to speak. But our future could be the past of a civilization that predated us by a billion years. So we might be living in a reality where such probes were already sent with no reference to us. It's not because we exist. They were sent a billion years ago before we existed. And they might be around us. How do we find out? Not by listening to what this popularizer of science says or what another popularizer of science says. That's not the issue. The issue is not how many likes that person gets on Twitter and whether that person is popular. The question is, what is the reality that we live in? And the only way to find out is to look through telescopes. That was the argument Galileo made 4 centuries ago. And I find it ridiculous that we haven't learned the lesson. Now, you would say, maybe scientists are conservative. And maybe these popularizers of science want to be conservative. Maybe that's the issue. But then I ask you, some of these conservative popularizers of science, they advocate notions like the multiverse, extra dimension, string theory landscape. They're not conservative at all. They're talking about things that were never tested experimentally. So how dare they speculate on things that we haven't tested experimentally when we know that we exist, right? And we know that we sent Voyager and New Horizons into space. Therefore, there could be others out there that did the same, so we can search for equipment sent by other civilizations. So how can they declare that as speculative and not worthy of our attention, not worthy of funding? Just to give you an example, there is the dark matter search. We don't know what most of the matter in the universe is. And for 4 decades, we've been searching as part of the mainstream of science, searching for the nature of dark matter. So we looked for specific types of particles, invested hundreds of millions of dollars, didn't find anything. Now, even if we found the weakly interacting massive particles, it would have very little impact on our daily lives. If we find that Oumuamua is a technological relic, or a UAP is a technological relic of another civilization, that would have a huge impact on society, on humanity. So how can we not fund such a search whatsoever, whereas at the same time look for weakly interacting massive particles at the level of hundreds of millions of dollars? Now, what scientists are saying, we need extraordinary evidence before we even engage in this discussion. And I say, if you don't invest any funds, you would never find anything. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's
Not even regular evidence. You
yeah,
know, we don't even need extraordinary evidence at this point. We just need regular evidence. You know, I mean,
exactly.
you're
But
not going to
we will
even
not
get
have
any evidence.
we will not have this evidence if we don't invest in the search. That's my point. So by ridiculing the subject,
Yes.
scientists maintain the status quo where they don't collect evidence. Therefore, there is no extraordinary evidence. Therefore, they're justified in not collecting evidence, and they will. So someone asked me, "How long do you think humanity can be ignorant?" And I said, "Forever. You can
Yeah.
decide not to look at your windows. You can be ignorant forever." Now, the question is whether you want to be ignorant. I think that the premise of science is let's find out what reality is like. That's what science is about. Not about, oh, let's get more likes on Twitter, or let's advocate for what we already know and say there is nothing else to be learned. Let's argue that anything weird in the sky must be a rock. That's not the premise of science. If we see something weird, we should admit it and just collect more evidence about it. That's what we should do as a reflex, and instead, there was a colloquium at Harvard about Oumuamua. And when I left the room with a colleague of mine that worked for decades on rocks in the solar system, that colleague said, Oumuamua is so strange, I wish it never existed. And
Yes.
that to me, that's crazy, because it says you actually don't like situations where something new shows up. You don't want it. You prefer not to admit it. And it should be the other way around. Scientists should behave like kids. When there is something new, you should be excited. Let's explore it. It's an opportunity for us to learn something new. I just don't understand this mentality.
I think, well, but Avi, you have to look, if you look back in history too, you have to remember, I think, that the people, we weren't very different at all in the 1600s.
Oh, sure.
People actually didn't change. We haven't changed so much, but everyone today likes to think that they're on the side that is the maverick side, like, oh, if I was back, if I lived back in the 1600s, of course I would have, believed Galileo, or, of course, because there was a time between, when we basically decided the earth was round, until everyone accepted it, right? 150 years or whatever. You look at evolution. I mean, look at evolution. We've had 160 years of evidence, and not a single shred of evidence has ruled evolution, a false theory. But still, how many Americans still, don't believe? So I think it's more the humans in general do not want to look. They don't want to look into the eye of the telescope,
Well, that may be the reason why we are not considered intelligent as of yet by some other civilizations. Because if you look at human history, not only that we are refusing to look for things that we do not recognize at the moment. You would think that we would learn something from the experience of Galileo, that we would try to behave better now. That's not the case. And I'm talking about the scientific community. I'm not talking about the public. I'm talking about the people who are paid to do what Galileo learned.
Isn't it funding though? Because I mean, just the short time I've looked into it, it seems like everyone is talking about funding. I would love to work on this or look into this, but I have no funding, so it's just
no. So the point is, federal funding is controlled by committees, and the committees are populated by mainstream scientists. And if the mainstream of science would be willing to invest at least a fraction of the funds in risky propositions, in things that are not yet accepted but could open up new windows into the universe, new results. If that was the case, then we would be much better off. But instead, what happens is, very often the argument is it's taxpayers' money, and therefore we should not risk it. But the point is, the taxpayers are curious about UAP. They are curious about extraterrestrial. So the scientists should have listened to the public and said, this is what the public wants. We should allocate a fraction of the funds to that rather than dark matter search. But they are not doing it. And unfortunately, it's a vicious circle, because if you're not funding the search, you will never find evidence, and therefore you're justified in arguing that there is no evidence. So, but I broke this ice, so to speak, because in recent weeks, what happened was, without me doing any fundraising, a couple of multi-billionaires showed up in the porch of my home and asked me questions about my book, Extraterrestrial. And then a number of them decided to give me money for my research without me asking for it. And within a few weeks, I got $2 million. And I decided that I can actually do it. I don't need anyone to approve it. No federal committee to, that is composed of mainstream scientists and needs to say yes. I can just use the money that I got. And therefore I got funded. By the way, when my book came out, my argument was this subject can attract new funds into science that are not taken from any other research. So you can continue to do your dark matter search for weakly interacting massive particles. I'm not taking any of that money.
Yes.
I'm just getting money from someone else that says this is an exciting subject. And that's exactly what I fulfilled. I just fulfilled my promise from 6 months ago. I said to the community, I said, why don't you work with me and we'll get more money into science? And at the same time, we'll also bring young people that are excited about science. Science is not supposed to be boring,
No.
It should be exciting. And actually, in the last few weeks, I got funded. And I got thousands of emails after the project was announced, the Galileo Project was announced. I got thousands of emails from people that are willing to contribute their time and money to the project. And that's a remarkable, I rest my case, so to speak.
Yeah, there was one interesting question here, but ultimately it goes down to, how can they help the project? Someone asked, does it help the project if people message their local observatories? Or I guess if people want to get involved, how can they help at this time?
Right. Well, so if it depends how much money they have at their possession. So
Yes.
if they have money to contribute, then of course they can contact me, and I'll, through my email address, and we will find. I will be glad to direct them to the path that helps to support the project. Otherwise, I must say that we are now, the research team is pretty much saturated. We have altogether about 70 people engaged in the project. It will be difficult for me to manage more than that.
Yes.
So the research team is about 20, and then we have about 20 advisory members, the people that advise the project, and then we have about 40 that are affiliated with the project. And so we're pretty much saturated in terms of the number of people involved. But if anyone is interested in following the project, there is a website at Harvard. And of course, if you have an expertise that we could benefit from, let me know. And when we get to the point where we need that expertise, I'll establish contact with the relevant people. And right now, what we are doing is selecting the instruments that we need to purchase off the shelf. So just to give you an example, if you had an object the size of a person and you wanted to get a megapixel image of it at a distance of a mile, meaning that you could resolve the head of a pin on the surface of that object, all you need is a telescope with a diameter of a meter, okay, to do that. You can't use a cell phone. Roughly half of the height of a person. But I noticed a few weeks ago, I looked at online and I saw that you can add such a telescope to your bag, add it to the bag. There is an online site. It costs $500,000.
Seems a lot.
But the point is, we want to get a high resolution image of a UAP so that we can tell whether it has a label saying made in China, made in Russia, or made on exoplanet X, that we want to distinguish. If it's made by humans, it's of no interest to me because, or to science more generally, because this is a technological object. It would be as uninteresting as finding a bird. If we find a bird, I don't particularly care about birds right now. And so a bird or a human-made object, that information I'm glad to transfer to some of the residents of Washington, D.C., if they are very curious about how come such an object exists above the sky,
Actually, Avi, I actually this morning, I had a 2-hour, meeting with someone about kind of my own side project, I'm not going to mention anything, but for IR, are you guys considering, what spectrum are you considering? Because
Yeah.
Dave Fouch, who I work with off and on, he actually has his own video where he sees a little ball of IR energy up in the air,
Yes.
and then
So,
when he goes to optical, it disappears, and it was there
right.
for 20 minutes. Yeah, I mean, video proof. We even have the video proof right now.
Right.
Um,
So
yeah.
calculation that I did over the last weekend, was if an object moves faster than sound through air, it rubs against the air, so the surface of any object will get heated up. We know that because supersonic airplanes or the space shuttle, when they rub against the air, they get heated up by hundreds of degrees, and therefore they emit in the infrared, as you were pointing out. And I calculated whether it's easy to detect them, and it turns out nowadays there are detectors that can easily detect such things out to a distance of even 5 miles. And therefore we plan to use a sensor in the infrared, as you point out.
Excellent.
Now, the advantage of an infrared sensor is that it can operate at night. Even if there is no sunlight reflected off the object, you could still see the heat emitted by the object. And if an object maneuvers fast through air, it must get heated up. And on top of that, you can get the shock, the bow shock, that the sonic boom that you get in the air, that glows as well, because the air gets heated. And on top of that, you can get any engine. If there is some heat emitted by an engine, you can detect it in the infrared. So definitely an infrared sensor is helpful.
Yes.
And in addition, we might use radar systems. They are also quite handy and not very expensive. That people use them on boats, to detect things out to a few miles. And so we will have a radar system, an infrared detector, and of course an optical telescope. And by the way, a few telescopes, so that we can monitor the motion of the UAP in 3 dimensions.
Yeah,
That's
I think
important.
the key is we need to be able to triangulate.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I'm having all these issues when I go to try and figure out, how far away something is. Normally we know how big it is, so then we can determine how far away it is. But if it's just if it's like a tic tac,
right,
you really don't know. So yeah, that second, and I guess we're trying to figure out how close do you need those cameras? Can you get them with meter, or does it have to be a kilometer apart or something?
Oh no, not kilometer. Even a few meters are good enough with the resolution of the telescope we're planning to use. So even a few meters are good enough. And then this is called parallax, where you have a difference in the viewing angle when you look from different directions. And so we will definitely do that, and by that infer the 3-dimensional motion of the object. And that's very important, because some people said the UAP behave in ways that our current technologies will not enable such motion.
And that's you mentioned one point that about the supersonic, the shock waves, the skin friction heating. Commander Fravor, from all their accounts of the Tic Tac, is that it didn't, there was no shock wave. Because supersonic actually for us is not so fast in a fighter. If something's going faster than supersonic, I should be able to figure it out, or an experienced pilot, if it's well over supersonic speed. So the fact that it didn't actually make a shockwave is
but how does Fravor, how would he detect the shockwave from?
That is a good question, actually. I have seen shockwaves. I know that sounds weird, but I've seen shockwaves.
You mean the heat emitted by the shockwave?
No, it was on a test of F-15s and F-22s. They were trying to see which one is louder, because people were complaining. They were saying that.
You mean from the sound?
Yes. So the sound.
Okay. But
you can actually see it.
An F-15 is a big object. It's like a few meters or 10. And I guess it depends on the size of the object and the distance. So it may well be that the sound was not very prominent. And
yes, that's a good point, because I keep hearing that everyone said it, that there's no supersonic waves. But why? Is it just based off witness testimony in the area, or is it?
No, but okay. So we will also put audio sensors. Now, I should
Yeah.
emphasize that the advantage of doing a scientific experiment is that you have full control over all the instruments. If you have a camera in a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet, then you don't exactly have full control over what's going on. So
No.
that's the advantage of doing a
Mm.
scientific experiment. That's why I think it should be done by scientists. And
Yes.
we have mostly astronomers on the team, and I mean, some of them are the best instrumentalists in astronomy, and I'm very excited to have this group of people. And I think we should be able to get high quality data. It will be open to the public because we're detecting it with our own instruments. They're not public. They're not government owned. The only reason that a lot of the data related to UAP is classified, there is this iceberg from which we see only the tip. The reason for that is that the sensors are government owned,
Yes.
and as a result, the data is not public. And we will have everything public. Everything will be open. And that's another advantage where other people can look at the data and decide for themselves what they make out of it.
Or there's one question here kind of related is how are you deciding on the location of the project sensors? Do you have to keep it secret? Are you concerned about
No. I mean,
yeah.
the only issue here in terms of keeping it secret is not to have hackers. There will be people that will send drones that fool us and stuff like that. But we can also we have to protect the instruments so that nobody would approach them. So usually, in observatories, there are usually security people protecting the instruments in observatories. And we might need the same just to make sure that nobody damages or sabotages the experiment. But in terms of the locations, that's an excellent question, because there were some reports that UAP concentrate around or cluster around, for example, nuclear facilities or military facilities.
Catalina Islands, off San Diego, the San Catalina Islands.
Right. Now, from the point of view of visibility, of course, the best place is the mountaintops, because there the atmosphere is more dilute. You can see to greater distances if you look to the horizon. But we will have to spread it. And we're planning, with the current budget, we can have about 10 telescope systems, but this will not allow us to have a comprehensive study. We hope to get funded 10 times more, at the level of tens of millions of dollars. If we get those donations, which we really need, then we can have a comprehensive study, because we'll have hundreds of telescope systems. And based on the estimates, from the report, the ODNI report, the report from the intelligence agencies, we made an estimate of the rate of such UAP incidents, and there we concluded that we need the hundreds of telescope systems. And I really hope that we will get funded 10 times more than we currently are.
Have you considered trying to make it profitable? Has that ever a thought that comes up?
Well,
could you make it like you own the picture? Like if you buy this system, you own the rights to the picture or something.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I'm not a business person. I'm not trying to make a profit out of anything. I'm just driven by scientific curiosity. And but there were 3 people that contacted me over the past few weeks saying that I can make a lot of money out of making it a business. 3 people from different continents, actually. And the fact that there were 3 people that contacted me from different continents with the same proposition implies that there is something behind, there is some truth behind it. We shall see what we make out of it. At the moment, it's a purely academic research project. And, the way I get the funds is they are channeled through the Harvard system, through the development office at Harvard. So it's regarded as an academic research project. And I was asked, actually, within Harvard, they said, explain to us why this is part of your research, because if it's not part of your research, it should be considered as an outside activity, and you will have limited time to pursue it. And I said, well, this project is using telescopes. And as an astronomer, throughout my career, I worked on interpretation of data that we collect through telescopes. And the Galileo Project is exactly that. except we focus on nearby objects instead of very distant objects. There is nothing in astronomy that says you have to look at objects beyond a certain distance. There is nothing. You can look through telescopes at any object you want. That's considered astronomy. And so they said, yes, okay, we accept that. That makes sense. So now it's regarded as part of my research. And, it's a project where I actually advertised the fellowship, a postdoc fellowship, to have a research assistant on this. And it is, as far as I'm concerned, it should be part of the mainstream in astronomy, because some of the objects we find, and even if one, that would be dramatic, even if one object that we find came from far away, from outside the solar system, obviously it's part of astronomy because it came from far away. And who said that astronomy should be just about physical objects that have no significance for life? That is definitely not the case. We are very much interested whether life exists elsewhere and whether we are the smartest kid on the block. That should be one of the most exciting questions in astronomy.
It's amazing. Yeah, we just a few more minutes here. I guess you love space. I love space. Why not considering, or are you considering any sort of space-based telescopes? Any options? With Elon Musk, with his Starship, they will need some test, packages to bring up there, maybe bring down. Are you considering this?
Yeah, definitely. So just to give you an example, when Oumuamua was discovered, we basically saw it from telescopes on the ground, on Earth, and from the Hubble Space Telescope that was hovering a little bit off the Earth, but not much. And we had limited ability to pin down the trajectory of Oumuamua. But if we have a telescope far away from Earth, for example, in a Lagrange point that is far from Earth, then we can do, as we said, a triangulation or parallax that would allow us to pin down the trajectory extremely well. And we can also design a space mission that will intercept the trajectory. We can easily tell if there is an excess push or anything about the reflectivity of the object as it tumbles around, because we will see it from different directions. So definitely having another telescope far from Earth would help a lot in accomplishing this goal.
Sorry, is that the James Webb Space Telescope? Isn't that supposed to go to the Lagrange point, or is that?
Yeah, but that will be L2, which
L2,
is roughly 1% of the Earth-Sun separation, so it's not very far from Earth. I'm thinking about like L5,
the other one. Yes, okay.
So then it would be roughly the separation between Earth and the Sun, and then you get 100 times better triangulation ability, because it's not a telescope just next to Earth. It's a telescope much farther away, 100 times farther than L2. And so you can actually do triangulation much better. You can, by looking at an object from different directions, so different, you can tell about the reflectance of the object, and you can learn a lot. Yeah, definitely. So that's something we definitely want to do. The other thing is, the surveying the moon. That's another interesting frontier, because the moon is just like a museum. It didn't have any activity, geological activity, didn't mix outer layers with inner layers, doesn't have an atmosphere where things burn up. So it basically collected all the objects that crashed on it over the past few billion years. And it's like a museum. You can look if there is any spacecraft that crashed on it that was not sent from Earth a long time ago. You can check for that.
Yes, that's amazing. And again, there's no time limit on my side. It's all just based on how your willingness, I guess, or your next scheduled event. But quickly, suppose it is a success. Let's say you find this. We find an interstellar object like Oumuamua, and then you're able to prove that it's interstellar. Is that the end of Galileo or the project? What happens?
If we find that it's extraterrestrial technology,
yes,
I would be excited to press some buttons on it and see what it does. And perhaps there would be huge commercial benefits if we find the technology from our future, because then we can import it to Earth and have a sort of quantum leap rather than developing it ourselves. And the other thing it will change, of course, is our perception about our place in the universe. We're not the smartest kid on the block. The other thing is we might want to treat each other more nicely. If you
Yes.
look at human history, a lot of it was driven by some people trying to feel superior relative to other people. Just think about the Second World War, where 75 million people died. That's 3% of the world population at that time, and much more than the COVID death rate so far. It was just one war triggered by racism, the Nazi regime trying to feel superior relative to other people. There were so much resources wasted on killing people without any. And if we find another civilization that is more intelligent than us, then all our differences become minuscule. They're not
Yes.
significant, and there is no point in trying to feel superior relative to each other. We are all part of the human species, one team. Let's work together towards a
Yes.
better future, and that will be another change. So altogether, I think it would be a huge wake-up call for us, and
Yes.
that's why it's such an important question. And when people attack me personally on Twitter or say bad things, it's not really about me.
Yes.
This is a question that is really important for the future of humanity. It's such a big question. How can we ignore it? How can it not be at the mainstream of science? Why would weakly interacting massive particles be more important for us
I
than
know.
finding whether we're the smartest kid on the block?
Yeah. What is that? That it's however many millions of dollars to detect those neutrinos that are going through. Insane. So one final thought. I'm very excited actually to even be able to present this idea to you, Avi. But I mentioned a little bit before. So you mentioned Galileo, which I think is just huge. But shortly after Galileo, you have a couple scientists, Robert Hooke and this guy, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, however you say it. And basically, they use that same lens technology, those new advancements in technology in 1665, I believe. So Galileo was in the 1610s, 1620s, around there. So these guys together, they used that technology and they basically turned the telescope around, right? They turned it around and they looked down, and this is what they found, right? This isn't one single just speck of seawater. If you look at that, every single drop of seawater on this Earth ultimately looks like this. Maybe not the Dead Sea, right? I think the Dead Sea is the one place that I've heard is no life. But I mean, look, they even found microbes frozen in Antarctic ice from thousands and thousands of years. So basically, we use this to look down, and they were blown away. And I remember reading about the same thing you mentioned, is that the church would, or whoever was in power, they would not look into they wouldn't go to the scope. They don't want to put their eye up.
Well, that's exactly right. What the point that you're making is life adapts. It seems to adapt once the temperature of Earth cooled enough for life to exist. Immediately life started forming, microbes and life is very adaptable. So I think the premise that we should have, the working assumption, is that there is nothing special or unique about our existence, that in fact, it's very common that we are one ant out of many ants on the sidewalk of the Milky Way galaxy, that we are nothing special. That should be out of modesty, let's assume that it's a very common phenomenon. Instead, what scientists are advocating is, unless you present extraordinary evidence, we are not willing to discuss this possibility that we might not be alone. And I find that really surprising. And why would that be? Why would we discuss extra dimensions and superstrings and all kinds of things that were not even tested, rather than advocating to search for things like us elsewhere? I mean, and by the way, one reason we may have not heard from another civilization is because we are very common. Things like us exist everywhere. We are nothing special. It's presumptuous of us to imagine that the aliens will come and have a party in our backyard and demonstrate to us that they exist. Just reminds me of what happened, with friends of my wife. When I met her, they assumed that there will be Prince Charming on a white horse showing up and making them a marriage proposal. And it never happened. So then they compromised with whoever showed up. And my point is, why should we feel that we are so special and unique that we will hear from them and they will declare their existence to us in our backyard in a way that will be extraordinary. It may not be like that. Space is vast. Things like us are common. We're nothing special. That should be the, out of modesty, that should be our starting working assumption. And then it's our duty to search for them rather than the other way around.
Excellent. I'm so happy you are out there, Avi. Really, I'm just so happy to have talked to you and that you're doing what you're doing. It's so awesome. I don't necessarily, it's a difficult job. It's not easy to be the person that stands out there and says, hey, everybody else, you're crazy. It's very difficult. So I'm very inspired by what you're saying. I completely agree with everything.
Thank you. I mean, to me, it's just a matter of common sense. And I don't really care how many likes I have on Twitter. I just express what I think. And the support that I get from the public and from funders illustrates that there is some merit to what I'm talking about, irrespective of how many people say bad things about it. I think it will win the day eventually, and all those critics will have to join the bandwagon when this becomes mainstream.
Which is excellent. So thank you, Professor. Thank you, Avi, so much for being here, and I sincerely hope we can work together, or at least talk in the future.
Thank you for hosting me. That was a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, Avi. Have a great day. See you.
Bye-bye.